Hey guys, Buildzoid here, and today we're going to be taking a look at the MSI GTX 1080 Ti Lightning. So this is MSI's sort of competitor to the EVGA Kingpin or the Galaxy Hall of Fame 1080 Ti's. So this thing is meant for extreme overclocking, for, running on LN2. It's not, I don't think it's pushed as far as, say, the Kingpin in terms of actual LN2 specific feature set. Or even the Hall of Fame. I'd argue the Hall of Fame probably actually has an even stronger VRM than this, but this is definitely the highest end card that MSI is making, and certainly not, compared to most 1080 Ti's, it is quite a lot of PCB compared to most of the other ones.
Before that, this is brought to you by EVGA's CLC 280 liquid cooler for CPUs, which we previously benchmarked and found to be a high performer given its relative silence to the temperature output. Learn more about this $140 cooler at the link in the description below.
So before we get into the VRMs, however, I'd like to address one minor problem I have with this card, and that's these three 8-pin power connectors, and the fact that they're completely unnecessary. There's just no way on earth that a 1080 Ti, even with liquid nitrogen, is going to pull 900 watts of power. Well, actually 972 watts of power. And some of you might be like, wait a minute, how are you getting to that number? Aren't these connectors rated for 150 watts? Well, that's the ATX spec for these, yes. They're spec'd for 150 watt by the PCIe and ATX stuff, but the company that actually makes these, which is Molex, and these are MiniFit Junior connectors from Molex, these are rated for 9 amps per pin pair. So each of these 8 pins has 3 12-volt lines, 3 ground lines. There's 2 other lines in there which don't actually transfer power. They're for detecting if you've plugged in a 6-pin or an 8-pin, or if you've even plugged in a connector at all. So there's a bit of safety built into 2. Like, the 2 of those pins are basically just safety checks. They're not actually used for power transmission. But you do have 3 grounds and 3 12 volts, and that leaves the power connector capable of delivering 324 watts at 12 volts if you have 18 gauge wiring coming from your PSU. Because actually, it's a limitation of the 18 gauge wires that sets the power, the maximum power that these connectors can do, because you can get these on a 16 gauge wiring, these will handle as high as 13 amps per pin pair. So yeah, but most power supplies are 18 gauge wired, so 324 watts is the limit you'll usually, that's like workable for most applications, because power supplies with 16 gauge wiring are pretty rare. Like, I don't have one, so, and I buy high-end power supplies, so if I got the card, I'd still be limited to that 324 watt figure. So with 3 of these, the card can do 972 watts, and it really doesn't need to have that many power connectors. I mean, even if it was only 2 8-pins, it would still have a 375 watt power limit by ATX spec, and that is still pretty high for a 1080 Ti. Like, for overclocking and such, you'd be fine. And then if you raise the power limit beyond that, it's still, like, the connector's not going to complain. You're just violating the ATX spec, which happens to be really conservative about what these connectors can and can't do. So basically, this whole 3 8-pin thing, it doesn't actually do anything for the overclocking capabilities of the card. It's a really easy marketing stunt to make people go, whoa, this card has 3 8-pins. It has to be great at overclocking because it's got so many power connectors. Which really just isn't the case. You're not even going to use, half the power capability of 2 of these. Because actually the card at stock, the stock power limit on one of these is apparently around 320 watts. So on stock, you're not even going to use half of 2 of these 8-pins, much less all 3 of them. So it's completely just a marketing stunt. It's not even remotely practical for this card to have this many 8-pin power connectors. So I'm not really a fan of that, because it's just silly to do this. Anyway, let's get on to things that are also kind of silly, but I'd argue less so because they're also kind of awesome. Like the 14-phase Vcore VRM located right over here. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 inductors, and then we have 14 power stages behind those. And we also have 7 doublers because you can't actually buy a 14-phase voltage controller. The max you can buy is an 8-phase. So here you have this chip right here, which that is an international rectifier IR3595. That's an 8-phase controller. Here it's running in 7-phase mode. It supports switching frequencies from 200 kilohertz up to 2 megahertz. Not that you would actually run at that 2 megahertz frequency, because that would just send VRM efficiency down, like VRM power efficiency down the drain, while giving you absolutely no benefit in terms of voltage stability or something like that. Well, it would, but it wouldn't be a measurable improvement. It wouldn't improve overclocking whatsoever. So, yeah, it's not going to run that high. Also, the card doesn't actually give you access to the switching frequency of the voltage controller, so you can't change that anyway. MSI is probably shipping the card with 600 kilohertz coming out of the actual voltage controller, just because once that goes through the doublers, which are international rectifier IR3599s, so these are doublers and or quadruplers. They're really, really basic. They just cut the signal, like they just take the 600 kilohertz signal and split it in half. So you get 300 kilohertz to your 2 phases hooked up to one of those doublers, which is normal. That's how all doublers work. It does not include any kind of fancy phase current balancing features or anything like that. Not that that is super necessary when this VRM is never really going to have any significant amount of current going through any one of the phases, just because of the ridiculous phase count that MSI is running here. So, you know, I don't have any complaints for the control scheme, and I'm assuming that 600 kilohertz to 600 kilohertz and 300 kilohertz actual phase frequency, because the international rectifier power stages that MSI is using are optimized to run best at 300 kilohertz. They're specifically designed to get best efficiency at around 300 kilohertz. You can get a little bit more if you go below that, but it's not worth the trade-off. Whereas going above that sends the efficiency really, like, the efficiency gets really bad really quick if you go beyond 300 kilohertz, and you don't really get any major benefits either. So I'm going to assume that the card runs them on 300 kilohertz, and the power stages in question are international rectifier IR3555s. So these are 60 amp power stages. These are not the best 60 amp power stages that international rectifier makes. The best ones would be the IR3575s, which also come with a partial metal casing, which basically improves heat dissipation from the MOSFETs and lowers the internal operating temperature. But the 3555, like this, is basically the second in line for best power stage that international rectifier makes. And the end result is that theoretically you could run a maximum current through this VRM and to the core of 840 amps, because, you know, each phase can do 60 amps thanks to the power stages. And then you have 14 phases, so that gives you 840 amps, and that would be doable if it weren't for the fact that an international rectifier 3555 pushing 60 amps of current produces about 12.5 watts of heat. So with 14 of them, that works out to around 175 watts of heat, and you can't actually hit that current level because the VRM would quite literally cook itself. Like, it would produce, at that point, it produces more heat than most high-end CPUs. Unless you start overclocking, in which case, obviously, CPUs can get hotter than that. So that's not really a practical rating. For actual current draws that a 1080 Ti might get through the VRM, this VRM actually gets really good efficiency. For example, 200 amps, which is slightly below what a stock 1080 Ti normally pulls. This VRM will produce about 18 watts of heat, and that is for the limited 0.9 volts that NVIDIA locks all their cards to. So, you know, 18 watts of heat on the VRM, pushing that voltage, 200 amps, and that 300 kilohertz figure from before. If you start going up, so like 250 amps, which this card will probably hit this current figure on its own just because it has a higher stock power limit. At this point, it'll produce about 21 watts of heat. If you overclock it manually further, the VRM should put out about 24.5, which is still like, this is really, really efficient, which is not surprising because this is a ridiculous VRM. Like 14 phases of 60 amp power stages is really, really good. It doesn't really get better than this, except maybe 16 phases of 60 amp power stages. And then technically you can also build 20 phase, 24 and 28 and 32 phase designs, except those are really rare because they're also really, really huge and impractical. So as far as practical VRM designs go, this is about as good as it gets. And it really shows because at 300 amps, this is putting out very, very little heat. As you keep going higher and higher, so let's say you somehow hit 400 amps, I don't think you can actually do that even with liquid nitrogen, that 400 amp figure. You'll sort of top out between 300 and 400 amps average. The card may peak beyond that. You know, burst current draw can go beyond that, but on average, these are rated for continuous, so you'll peak between 300 and 400 amps on liquid nitrogen even. So really, this VRM is ridiculous overkill because 400 amps, the VRM will still only put out about 35 watts of heat, which is still completely coolable. If you get the VRM some airflow and it has an adequate heatsink. So that's really nice. And just for the sake of it, if you did manage to push 500 amps through this VRM, main issue being I don't think a 1080 Ti, even on liquid nitrogen pushing about 2.6 gigahertz, let's say 1.6 volts core, won't actually pull 500 amps. It won't pull that much current. So if you did somehow, however, get a 1080 Ti to pull 500 amps, then it would still only produce about 52 watts of heat, which this is starting to be problematic. You know, 52 watts of heat, that's not insignificant, but it's still very, very coolable, given enough airflow and a big enough heatsink. So that's not too bad. In fact, it's absolutely great because really the only other VRM that even, well, no, there's only one VRM on 1080 Ti's that is actually better than this one, and that's the one found on the Galax Hall of Fame card, which is a 16 phase, also made up of International Rectifier 3555. So you basically get two more phases of what you already have here. So really, this VRM design is just ridiculous overkill, and for a 1080 Ti, like, yeah, it's ridiculous overkill for a 1080 Ti, but this is a flagship, and, you know, it's unnecessary, yes, but even on liquid nitrogen, it's unnecessary, but ultimately, it really, really isn't, you know, it's not, like, it's not, I don't have a problem, as much of a problem with this as I have with the 3/8 pins, because this serves no practical purpose. Here you can kind of argue that, well, no, you can't, but I somehow prefer the 14 phase VRM to the 3/8 pins. Because this like, and no, I can't justify it, but it is a really, really nice VRM, even if it's completely overkill for a 1080 Ti. Anyway, let's move on to something else that's completely overkill as well, the memory VRM, which is a 3-phase, located right over here, and controlled by this chip right over there. That chip is a International Rectifier IR3570, running in 3-phase mode. This is a chip that does 3+2 phase output, so the +2 part is not running. It also does the 200 kilohertz to 2 megahertz switching frequency range. It's pretty much the same series of chip. So, similar specs on these. The MOSFETs here are dual NFETs from Gimmicks Semiconductor. These are QM3816N MOSFETs. These aren't particularly great. Then again, memory VRMs really don't need amazing MOSFETs on the other hand either, but these are kind of slow. They're not super efficient, but with 3 phases worth of these, the memory VRM is capable of putting out 30 amps of current while only producing about 5 watts of heat. So that is, you know, plenty for the GDDR5X memory chips that the card comes with. So again, I have no complaints here. The 3-phase memory memory power is also on par with what you'd see like on the Kingpin, which is also 3-phase memory power, or the Galax Hall of Fame, which is also 3-phase memory power. And this does actually can like get you a couple more megahertz out of memory when like really hammering it. But the thing is, it's like, I'd say even a 2-phase shouldn't have a problem. Single-phase memory power designs, certainly, like, yeah, you can go up from there. Like, 2-phase designs do have an advantage over single-phase, but 3-phase over 2-phase on memory, the difference isn't generally that massive. So, though I'm not complaining here, like, yeah, this is just fine. It is certainly fitting of a card that has the Lightning name, the Lightning name on it, and has a 14-phase VRM for Vcore on a card that on a GPU core that really doesn't need it. So this is definitely a nice enough memory VRM. And let's start moving on to all of the minor VRMs around the card, like this one right here, that one right, well, you can't see most of this one, it's on the back of the card, but that there is another VRM here. So this right here, this would be basically the VRM that powers that VRM and also that VRM, because, well, basically this would be variable gate drive. You shouldn't have control over this. MSI only really gives you overvoltage control for the for other voltages that I'll cover later. But basically this is power for the VRMs to run on, and it should be set to 7 volts because that's where the International Rectifier 3555 hits peak efficiency. So yeah, that's what that is. It might be set to 5 volts, but it's probably set to 7 because that is IR stuff is optimized to run on 7 volts best, and the QM3816 certainly won't complain about running on 7 volts either, as those can go all the way up to 15 volts gate drive. So, that's that VRM exists. It doesn't really affect overclocking because ultimately it just affects the efficiency and running capabilities of the Vcore and the memory VRM. This VRM down here is the 1 volt PEX or PLL volt VRM, whichever you prefer to call it. This powers part of some of the PCI. Well, it powers the PCIe connection of the GPU. And it also powers some of the internal PLLs of the GPU core, which is why it's called PEX/PLL. This voltage is very useful on liquid nitrogen. It makes a huge amount of difference having this voltage under control when overclocking on liquid nitrogen. I've done a little bit of overclocking with Pascal on liquid nitrogen. I didn't actually bother to modify my PEX rail, but from what Tin from EVGA said, Tin is a power engineer who works with Kingpin on the Kingpin cards, he said that this rail is absolutely necessary if you want to, like, having voltage control for PEX is absolutely necessary if you want to exceed 2.5 gigahertz on liquid nitrogen. On air cooling and water cooling, I imagine it does very little, if nothing at all. As that is typical of Pascal cards. Changing Vcore doesn't really do much. Changing PEX doesn't really do much. Changing the memory voltage, well, I'm not sure about GDDR5X. I imagine it might scale a little bit with memory voltage, but I'm not sure. So, yeah, not sure about that one either. And the last VRM we have on here is this VRM right here. This is the 1.8 volts. This is for some of the internal PLLs of the GPU core, as well as VPP for all of the GDDR5X chips. This is basically a little supporting voltage. It doesn't really affect overclocking much at all. Even on liquid nitrogen, it doesn't really make much of a difference. Now, one of the cool things with this card is that it is kind of targeted at extreme overclockers, so you do get the usual core voltage control. Well, it's not really control in my opinion, because it's just that slider that goes to plus 100 and then it still ends up being 1.09 volts because NVIDIA said so. But you do get control, some limited control over the 1.8 volt rail, the PEX PLL rail, the Vcore Vcore you have everywhere, and the memory voltage. You do get software control over all of these. I am just not sure how far it goes and how well implemented it is, because I do not have the card in hand to check that. So, yeah. But there is software voltage control for those, though I imagine they do. Most of them shouldn't do anything if you're on air cooling or water cooling. And if you're on liquid nitrogen, I'm not sure if they're if the range on them is high enough. I imagine it might not be, just because the core voltage is still limited on to 1.09 volts, even on this car. Every MSI's gone ahead and giving you some voltage control over everything else, and it's like the Vcore is still stuck at the useless low voltage limit. So yeah, there was an attempt at getting voltage control, that for sure. And I guess it does mean that if you found some, I guess there must be some kind of non-public access tool for this card that is not accessible to the general public that gives you higher voltage controls, because MSI has done that in the past with previous Lightning cards. There is such a thing known as Afterburner Extreme. You've probably never heard of it, because you probably shouldn't have heard of it. Afterburner Extreme is a special version of Afterburner that the only way to get that was to basically message an MSI representative and ask for it, then sign an NDA agreement, and then you got the program. And the reason why this program existed was it gave you a lot more voltage control on, say, cards like the GTX 580 Lightning, 480 Lightning, 6970 Lightning, all of the older Lightning cards. Afterburner Extreme was absolutely necessary for those to be fully controllable. So I imagine there's a similar situation with this card, because NVIDIA has been pretty strict about not allowing the general public to have proper voltage control on their GPUs. Because apparently it breaks GPUs, which I guess is true. Yeah, that's true, but it's my freaking card. If I want to break it, I should be allowed to. But yeah, ultimately, I'm not sure how well the voltage control is implemented. There's probably a non-public tool that gives extreme overclockers. I could probably ask for it and get it, and get proper voltage control. But for most people, I think it's if you're buying this card for air cooling or water cooling, I'm going to say that the extra voltage controls probably don't do anything, and they're mostly a marketing gimmick. If you want to run the card on LN2, you'll need to get your hands on a extended limit version of Afterburner or something, which might be a pain as well. Other than that, it also features for LN2 overclockers 3 voltage read points right here, which is kind of cool. So you can check memory voltage, core voltage, and I assume this voltage down here, because that's the important one, even though I'm pretty sure this one's accessible as well. It might be gate drive. I'm not sure about that. Again, I'd need to see the software for the card myself. But you do get voltage measuring capabilities for 3 different voltages: memory, GPU, and the PLL. And this is really, really nice for extreme overclockers, because you can basically monitor the voltage of the card while running a benchmark using a digital multimeter, which is also more consistent, because sometimes software just gives you really, really weird readouts depending on what you're doing. So that's a nice feature to have. And then up here, you do get a dual BIOS switch with an LN2 BIOS on it. I have no idea if that LN2 BIOS is actually implemented properly. I'm guessing it probably isn't. Just because, like most cards that ship with an LN2 BIOS, it's well, I've never used a previous Lightning, so I can't compare to that. But most of the time, the LN2 BIOSes aren't I imagine this lifts the power limit and that kind of thing, but I doubt it gives you more voltage range, or, well, NVIDIA cards don't have cold slow issues. You don't actually need a special BIOS to remove that, but I kind of doubt it does anything more than lift the power limit, which, to be completely honest, I think is kind of sad for a BIOS called the LN2 BIOS. But yeah, that's the card. The PCB is certainly nice. The implementation of the features on it, I have no idea. I kind of suspect they're kind of watered down so that they're so that the card can be sold to the general public without people accidentally blowing up their cards by shoving 1.4 volts through the core while on air cooling or water cooling. But ultimately, yeah, the PCB is really nice. The 3 8-pins are kind of stupid. Most of the features on this are completely useless for the average day-to-day user. For extreme overclockers, it really depends on how well they're implemented. But the stuff is here. It is all available. It's just a case of, does it work properly? So this is definitely a card I'd love to try out in person, like get around to get a chance to mess around with it. Because in theory, if everything is implemented properly on this, it should be exactly like the Kingpin, where you buy the card, insulate the card, and run it on LN2. Because you may also notice that that was one thing I pointed out on the Kingpin, is this entire area of the GPU is, again, clear of anything too tall to clear an LN2 pot, except maybe this connector. I think some LN2 pots might not clear that. That might be an issue. But at least the Vcore VRM and all the capacitors are kept well away from the GPU core. So this could basically, this could be a really good, this could be really close to the Kingpin in terms of overclocking capabilities, or it could be really bad, depending on how well the voltage controls are implemented and the LN2 BIOS works. So yeah, that's it for this video. Thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave a comment down below. Please consider supporting Gamers Nexus and videos like this by donating to the Gamers Nexus Patreon. And if you would like to see more videos like this and other overclocking related videos, you could head over to my channel called Actually Hardcore Overclocking, where I basically do more overclocking stuff. That's it for this video. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.